The judge froze when his eyes landed on me. For a moment, the entire courtroom fell silent. Nobody understood why his expression had changed so suddenly, why his voice trembled when he whispered, "It's her." That was the moment everything began to unravel, but to understand why, you need to know my story. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories. My name is Ruth, and I am 70 years old. For most of my life, I was simply seen as a mother, a grandmother, a woman who worked hard and asked for nothing in return. Every morning I rise before the sun, open the creaking back door of my small house, and step into my garden. The smell of wet soil greets me, mingling with the soft fragrance of roses and lavender. I always pause there for a moment, letting the cool morning air brush against my skin before I kneel down to water the African violets. My late husband planted them with me decades ago, and even now, long after his passing, I care for them as if he were still here, watching over my shoulder with a gentle smile. This garden is more than flowers and soil. It is my diary, my comfort, and my reminder that life, no matter how broken or tired, can still bloom. Each leaf, each fragile petal, carries a memory. The cherry tree at the far end of the yard holds the swing we built for my daughter when she was little. She would giggle and fly through the air, her hair glinting in the sun, while I clapped and cheered, dreaming of the bright future I wanted her to have. But those dreams were not free. They came at a cost. I worked nights cleaning school classrooms when no one else was around, pushing heavy mops across cold linoleum floors. I sewed clothes late into the night, the sound of the sewing machine humming through the darkness, while my daughter slept peacefully in her bed. On weekends, I baked pies, cookies, and cakes to sell at the market. My hands were always tired, but my heart was full of hope. Each dollar I earned, each sacrifice I made, was for her, for Dawn, my only child. I wanted her to have the education I never received, the opportunities I had only dreamed about. My own childhood had been hard and unforgiving, filled with struggles that shaped me into a woman who knew how to endure, but rarely how to ask for help. So when Dawn was born, I made myself a silent promise. She would never feel the weight of that same burden. She would know joy, security, and freedom, and for years, I believed I was succeeding. I remember birthdays when I stayed up the entire night before, sewing her dresses by hand because we couldn't afford new ones. I would wrap them carefully, pretending they had come from a fancy store, just to see her eyes light up when she unwrapped the box. I remember the smell of cinnamon rolls on exam mornings when I woke up early to bake them fresh so she would feel loved and supported as she studied. I remember every scraped knee I patched, every story I told before bedtime, every prayer whispered over her as she slept. Those moments were my reward. They were the proof that love, even when built on sacrifice, could still feel sweet. But life has a way of changing when you least expect it. After my husband passed away, I thought Dawn and I would grow closer. I believed that, in our shared grief, we would find comfort in each other. But instead, she drifted away. Slowly at first, with calls that came less often, visits that felt more like obligations than desires. She would sit at my table with polite smiles, her eyes always on the clock, her words rehearsed and short. Then, after she married Dave, things became worse. Dave was a man with sharp edges, not just in his words, but in the way he carried himself. From the first day he walked into my home, I felt the weight of his disapproval. He slumped into my late husband's armchair as though it already belonged to him, switched on the television without a greeting, and treated me like I was a shadow in my own house. His arrogance was not subtle. It was displayed in every gesture, every smirk, every dismissive glance. Yet, I kept smiling. I kept setting the table every Sunday, laying out the dishes as though the warmth of food could soften the coldness in their hearts. I cooked Dawn's favorite meals: chicken and dumplings, baked bread, the kinds of food that had once made her eyes sparkle as a child. I hoped, foolishly, that familiar flavors might stir familiar love. But week after week, the silence grew louder. Their visits became shorter, their excuses more elaborate. And every time they left, I felt the echo of an emptiness that grew heavier in my chest.
One Thursday in October, I decided to give it one more try. I spent the whole day cooking Dawn's favorite dish, polishing the table, placing fresh flowers in a vase at the center. I even pulled out the embroidered tablecloth I had sewn when she was a teenager, thinking maybe she would notice. Maybe it would remind her of the mother who had spent nights bent over fabric just to create something special for her. When they arrived, Dave walked past me without a word, collapsing into the armchair as though I didn't exist. Dawn wore a green dress I had once bought her, but her face was colder than January ice. She didn't look around the room, didn't notice the flowers or the tablecloth. She only sat on the edge of the chair, her voice clipped and distant when she finally spoke. "Mom, we need to talk." It was the kind of voice you use with a stranger, not with the woman who had carried you, raised you, sacrificed everything for you. And as I looked at her, a chill crept through my bones. Something was about to change, and not in the way I had hoped. Dawn's words that evening cut through the warm air of my kitchen like a sharp blade, words spoken without tenderness, without the gentleness that once lived in her voice, and without the warmth of the daughter I had raised. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, her tone flat and almost rehearsed, as though this moment had been prepared in advance not with love, but with cold calculation. I looked at the table I had spent the entire day preparing, the dumplings simmering in their broth, filling the air with the fragrance of herbs and home, the flowers in the center of the table standing fresh and bright in their vase, and the embroidered cloth, the one I had stitched with my own hands when she was a teenager, spread out neatly beneath it all. For a moment, it struck me how strange it felt to see all this love and effort laid out like a feast, and yet to feel it shrinking into something meaningless, like a stage set for a play in which I no longer had a part to perform. "Of course, dear," I answered softly, trying to push a smile onto my lips even though the heaviness in my chest pressed harder with every passing second. My hands trembled slightly as I folded them together on the table, waiting for her to speak, while behind her, Dave had already claimed his place in my late husband's armchair. His body slouched, his eyes fixed on the glowing television screen, as though I were invisible in my own home. Dawn cleared her throat, still avoiding my eyes, and when she finally spoke, the words were cold and practical, delivered in the clipped voice of someone delivering news rather than sharing feelings. "Dave and we've been talking," she began, her glance flicking quickly toward him before returning to the floor. "We think it's time you considered moving into a smaller place. This house is too much for you." Her words rang in my ears, foreign and yet cruelly clear, because this was not just a house, this was the place where she had taken her first steps on the old wooden floor, where my husband and I had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where laughter once spilled into every corner, and where every creaking floorboard carried a story we had lived together. To imagine leaving it was like tearing the pages from my own life, and yet she spoke as though it were only a matter of practicality, as though this home, my sanctuary, my memory, my proof of devotion, were no more than an inconvenience. "But this is my home," I whispered, the words trembling even as I tried to steady them. "This garden, this kitchen, your father and I built our lives here. I'm managing, I promise you I'm fine." She looked back at me then, her eyes hard and unyielding, and her voice sharper than I had ever remembered it. "Mom, don't make this difficult. You're not young anymore. And Dave thinks." That phrase, "Dave thinks," landed like a hammer against my heart, because it told me that her thoughts were no longer her own, that the bond we once shared had been replaced by his opinions, his judgments, his influence over her. For a moment, I wanted to rise from my chair and remind her of every night I had worked while she slept, every dollar I had saved so she could attend school, every stitch I had sewn and every meal I had cooked with nothing but love for her. I wanted to shake her into remembering the truth of her childhood, but the words caught in my throat, stuck behind the weight of betrayal, and I sat there in silence while she continued to speak in that distant voice, and Dave smirked faintly at the television screen. The days that followed were no kinder. Her visits became less about seeing me and more about discussing my future, as though I were a task on a list she needed to complete. She spoke of apartments and assisted living facilities with the same detachment one might use to discuss rearranging furniture, and each time she brought it up, I felt myself shrinking a little more, not just as a mother but as a human being whose life had been spent building hers. I tried to fight the growing loneliness by pouring myself into the only things that still gave me comfort, tending my garden with careful hands, baking bread even though no one sat at the table to share it, polishing the photographs of my late husband and whispering to him as though he could still hear me. And then came the day that broke me more deeply than I thought possible. It was a gray Thursday in October, the sky heavy with clouds that pressed low over the earth, the kind of day that seemed designed for sorrow. But I woke with determination in my heart, believing that if I tried hard enough, I could reach her again. I could remind her of the warmth we once shared. I could rekindle something long buried. I began cooking early, rolling out the dough for dumplings in the quiet of the morning, simmering broth until the whole house smelled of comfort and memory, and carefully ironing that embroidered tablecloth once more until every crease was gone. When the door opened that evening, I forced hope into my smile, but it crumbled as quickly as it came. Dave brushed past me without a word, the smell of his cologne trailing behind him, and went straight for my husband's chair, his body sinking into it as though it had always been his. He flicked on the television, stretched his legs out with a sigh, and did not so much as glance in my direction. Dawn entered next, wearing the green dress I had once bought her in happier years, but instead of warmth, her expression was as cold and unreadable as the autumn wind. She sat stiffly at the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly together, and with a voice that carried no affection she said, "Mom, we need to talk about next steps." Next steps. The words stung with finality, as if my life had been reduced to a plan on paper, as if I were not a woman but a responsibility to be managed. I sat there, looking at the table I had prepared, at the dumplings steaming gently, at the flowers standing proud in their vase, and at the cloth beneath it all that carried the stitches of my younger hands. The sight blurred, though whether it was from the steam or the tears I refused to shed, I could not tell. "What do you mean, next steps?" I asked quietly, though my voice shook despite my efforts. She sighed, her eyes sliding again toward Dave before she answered. "About selling the house, about moving you somewhere more manageable. Dave thinks." And again that name. Again that phrase. Dave thinks. It was in that moment that something inside me cracked. It was not a dramatic break, not a shout or a storm, but the quiet shattering of something that had been fragile for too long. I realized then that no matter what I said, no matter how much I pleaded, she had already chosen her path. She had chosen him. I nodded slowly, my hands trembling under the table where she could not see. "I see," I whispered, though inside I wanted to scream, to shake her, to demand she remember who I was and what I had given. But she only nodded back, as though the matter were settled, and when they left that night, the house fell into a silence so thick it pressed against my chest. The dumplings sat cold and untouched, the flowers drooped in their vase, and the tablecloth, once so full of meaning, lay heavy with the weight of rejection. It was in that silence, more than any other moment, that I felt something stir inside me, something I had not felt in years, a strength and a truth buried deep beneath years of sacrifice. I did not yet know what shape it would take, but I knew that change was coming, and that the world, which had once overlooked me as an ordinary old woman, was about to see me as something far different. The days after that night blurred together in a haze of silence and routine, each morning beginning as it always had, with the kettle whistling softly on the stove, with the steam curling into the quiet air, and with me standing at the window that overlooked my garden, holding the chipped mug I had used for more years than I could count. Yet even as I watered the African violets, as I bent down to pull weeds from between the rows of roses, there was a heaviness in my chest that no ritual could lift, for the house that had once been a sanctuary of love and laughter now echoed with the sound of absence, a silence that reminded me of what I had lost and of the daughter who no longer looked at me with love in her eyes. I found myself wandering through rooms not as a woman living her life, but as a ghost moving through memories, each photograph whispering of days that seemed impossibly far away. In one frame, Dawn was 6 years old, smiling with icing smeared across her cheeks from the birthday cake I had stayed up all night to bake. In another, she was 13, proudly wearing a dress I had sewn by hand when we could not afford the store-bought kind. Every picture was a reminder not only of what I had given, but of how quickly those years had slipped through my fingers, and how completely they had vanished from her memory, as though my sacrifices had been erased by the man now sitting in her heart like a stone. And yet, as I walked those quiet halls, I began to feel another presence, not only of the family I had built but of the woman I had been long before anyone called me mother or wife. Beneath the wrinkles and the gray hair, beneath the bent shoulders of age and years of labor, there still lived the Ruth of another time, a Ruth who had known struggle not as inconvenience but as survival, who had once carried secrets too heavy to share, who had faced things my daughter could never have imagined, and who had locked those memories away because being a mother demanded silence, demanded sacrifice, demanded that I bury my own life so that hers could grow. At night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the house quiet but my thoughts restless, and I felt those old memories begin to stir like shadows pressing against a locked door. I had buried them so deeply that even I sometimes forgot who I had been before motherhood. But now, with every cold glance from Dawn and every smug word from Dave, it was as if the lock had begun to weaken, as if the truth was demanding to be remembered. I thought of the years before Dawn, the girl I had once been, a girl who had grown up not in comfort but in hardship, who had been forced to fight her way through a world that had little patience for weakness, who had learned quickly that survival was not given but earned. I remembered faces from that time, voices that had whispered promises and threats, places I had vowed never to return to in my mind, and choices that had changed the course of my life forever. Sometimes, late in the evening, I would catch my reflection in the kitchen window, and for a fleeting second, I did not see the fragile grandmother everyone assumed I was. I saw the eyes of a younger woman who had once carried herself differently, with a quiet strength that could unsettle even those who thought themselves powerful. That woman had not disappeared. She had simply been hidden, buried under years of motherhood, years of devotion, years of silence. And now, as if called back by betrayal, she was beginning to awaken. The moment of awakening came not in a thunderclap but in something small. I had gone to the local store one afternoon, my shawl wrapped tightly around me against the autumn chill, and as I walked past the rows of shelves, I heard two women whispering near the counter. Their voices were low, but their words carried clearly to my ears. "Isn't that her? It looks like her. No, it can't be, she's too old now, but those eyes." I froze, my fingers tightening on the basket in my hand, my heart pounding as I realized they were looking at me, and not as Ruth the grandmother, not as Ruth the quiet widow who lived at the end of the street, but as someone else, someone they recognized from a different time. I lowered my head, walked quickly past them, and left the store with my breath shallow and my thoughts racing, because I understood in that moment what I had tried for so long to deny. The past does not stay buried forever. That night, as I sat alone again at my kitchen table, I whispered my late husband's name into the silence, as though he could answer me, as though he could steady the storm rising in my chest. "They're starting to remember," I said softly, my voice breaking. "And if they remember, so will she." I knew then that my daughter, who had dismissed me as nothing more than a burden, had no idea who I really was. She thought of me only as an old woman, fragile and dependent, but she did not know the truth of what I had endured, the battles I had fought, the things I had carried in silence. She had never asked, never wanted to know, and so she could not imagine that the mother she now pushed aside was a woman whose story was not one of weakness, but of survival and strength. The realization was both painful and liberating, for it told me that even though Dawn had abandoned me, even though she had chosen her husband's voice over mine, I was not powerless, and I was not finished. A part of me that had been sleeping for decades was stirring awake, and though I did not yet know what shape it would take, I could feel it pressing closer, ready to reveal itself. It was only a matter of time before the world, and my daughter, would discover that Ruth, 70 years old, tired and seemingly ordinary, was not who they thought she was. And it was only a matter of time before the past I had locked away would come crashing into the present, changing everything forever, The weeks that followed passed like a dream I could not wake from, each day filled with the same routines of tending the garden, brewing the morning coffee, and walking through rooms that seemed larger and emptier with every step, yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of my life there pulsed a steady current of something else, something that had begun to stir within me, and would not be silenced. I could feel the past pressing closer, the walls between then and now thinning. With each whisper in the grocery store, with each cold glance from Dawn, with each dismissive laugh from Dave, and though I tried to tell myself I could keep the truth locked away, I knew in my heart that the time was coming when the lock would finally break. It came sooner than I expected, and not in the way I had imagined. One morning, a letter arrived, official in its tone and heavy in its weight, summoning me to court. My daughter's name was on the document, her signature marking the beginning of what she had decided to do, and my heart clenched as I realized the depth of her betrayal. She had not only dismissed me as a burden but had chosen to drag me into a courtroom to make her case, to strip me of the home that had been my sanctuary, to claim in front of strangers that I was incapable of managing my own life. For a long moment, I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hand, the African violets blooming quietly on the windowsill, and I thought of every sacrifice I had made, every dream I had surrendered, and every ounce of love I had poured into her, only to arrive at this. When the day came, I walked into the courthouse with my shoulders straight, my shawl wrapped around me, and my steps steady though my heart beat heavily beneath my ribs. Dawn was already there, sitting with Dave, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the papers in her lap rather than on me. She did not rise to greet me, did not smile, did not even acknowledge my presence beyond the brief flicker of her eyes. And in that moment, I understood fully that I was no longer her mother in her heart, but an obstacle to be overcome. The courtroom itself was cold, the walls bare and unyielding, the benches filled with strangers whose lives would never again cross mine. Yet the weight of their gaze pressed down on me as though each one could see the cracks in my story, the secrets I carried within me. I took my place quietly, folding my hands in my lap, waiting for the judge to enter, waiting for the moment when this trial would begin, though I knew already that it was not simply about my house or my independence. It was about identity, about truth, about a life that had been hidden for far too long. And then it happened. The door opened, and the judge entered, his robe sweeping behind him as he made his way to the bench. His expression was calm at first, his movements steady and practiced, but when his eyes lifted and landed on me, something changed. He froze mid-step, his face draining of color, his breath catching audibly in the stillness of the room. The papers in his hand trembled, and for a moment, time itself seemed to stop. "It's her," he whispered, his voice breaking the silence though he spoke almost to himself. The entire courtroom fell into stunned quiet, the shuffle of feet and the murmur of voices vanishing as though the very air had been sucked from the room. People turned their heads, their eyes moving from him to me, confusion flickering across their faces, because they could not understand why the judge, a man of composure, of authority, of law, would falter so visibly at the sight of a 70-year-old grandmother sitting quietly on a wooden bench. Dawn's head snapped toward me, her brow furrowing in bewilderment, her lips parting as though to ask a question she did not yet know how to form. Dave leaned forward, his smug confidence slipping for the first time since I had known him, his eyes darting between the judge and me with something that looked very much like fear. I sat still, my hands folded, my gaze steady, though inside my chest my heart pounded with the rhythm of a past I had tried so long to silence. The judge's words echoed in the still air. "It's her," and with them came the shattering of the last barrier I had built between who I had pretended to be and who I truly was. None of them knew, not my daughter, not her husband, not the strangers in the courtroom, that the woman they thought of as a tired grandmother had once lived a life very different from the one they imagined. None of them knew the struggles I had endured, the dangers I had faced, the choices that had defined me in ways no one had ever suspected. And now, with the judge's reaction, with his recognition of a face he had not seen in decades, the truth was no longer mine to keep. The silence stretched on, thick and unbroken, until at last the judge lowered himself into his seat, his eyes still locked on mine, his voice unsteady as he began the proceedings, though the tension in his tone betrayed the storm that had been unleashed. My daughter shifted uncomfortably, her confusion growing with each passing second, and I knew that before this trial was over, she would learn the truth of who her mother really was, and that truth would change everything she thought she knew. For 70 years I had been Ruth the mother, Ruth the grandmother, Ruth the widow who lived quietly in her small house and tended her garden. But in that moment, as the judge's voice trembled and the courtroom held its breath, I became once again the woman I had once been, the woman I had hidden, the woman whose story had been buried beneath sacrifice and silence. And for the first time in decades I understood. The past had finally caught up with me, and there was no turning back.